Jack Phillips rushed through the busy hallways of the television studio, his coffee spilling slightly as he dodged interns carrying equipment. As the producer of The View for the past 8 years, Jack had seen everything from political meltdowns to surprise celebrity engagements. But today was different. His phone had not stopped ringing since 7 a.m., and the calls had turned his ordinary Tuesday into potential television history. Jack entered the production room and called for everyone's attention. The staff quieted down immediately, sensing his unusual excitement. "I just got off the phone with not one but 2 Hollywood legends," Jack announced, pausing for effect. "Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro both want to come on the show this week to promote their projects." The room erupted in chatter. Mary Duncan, the booking assistant, raised her hand. "Wait, are you suggesting we book them together, on the same day?" Jack smiled. "Not just the same day, the same segment." The production team exchanged worried glances. Everyone in the industry knew about the tension between the 2 actors. Their political differences had been highlighted in various interviews over the years, and rumors of a falling out at an awards ceremony in 2018 had circulated widely. "But they hate each other," said George Brown, the assistant producer. "Remember that comment De Niro made about Eastwood's empty chair speech? And Eastwood's response about actors who should stick to reading scripts?" added Lucy Adams, the talent coordinator. Jack set down his coffee cup. "That's exactly why this will be ratings gold. We won't tell either of them that the other is coming. We'll say we had a last-minute booking change." The team looked uneasy but excited. In the competitive world of daytime television, this kind of spontaneous drama was impossible to script. 3 days later, the studio buzzed with nervous energy. Security had been doubled, and the entire staff had signed extra confidentiality agreements. In her office, Carol Wright, the show's main host for 15 years, practiced her opening lines while her makeup artist applied the final touches. "Barbier, we sure this is a good idea?" Carol asked when Jack walked in. "We could have a disaster on our hands." "Or the most talked about episode in daytime television history," Jack replied. "Just keep the conversation moving if things get tense." Down the hall, Susan Miller led Clint Eastwood into the main makeup room. At 94, the legendary actor and director still carried himself with the same straight-backed dignity that had made him an icon. His weathered face had only gained character with age, the deep lines telling stories of decades in front of and behind the camera. "Coffee, Mr. Eastwood?" Susan asked, gesturing to the refreshment table. "Black, please," he replied, in his famously quiet voice. "And call me Clint." Susan handed him the coffee and began preparing her makeup supplies. Eastwood sipped his drink and looked around the room with curious eyes. For someone who had directed over 30 films, he seemed genuinely interested in the behind-the-scenes operations of the talk show. "You've been on our show twice before, but it's been a few years," Susan said as she gently applied foundation to his face. "We're all very excited to have you back." Eastwood nodded. "I don't do much publicity these days, but my new documentary about the American West needs the attention. These streaming services have changed how we promote films." In another makeup room down the hall, Robert De Niro was reviewing notes with his publicist Nancy Wells. At 81, De Niro remained one of Hollywood's most respected actors, known for his intense preparation and complete transformation into his characters. "Remember to mention the film festival dates," Nancy reminded him, "and try to avoid any political questions if possible. We're here to promote the movie." De Niro nodded, his focus intense. "Who else is on the show today?" Nancy hesitated for just a second. "Just some lifestyle expert in the first segment. You'll be the main guest." Outside in the hallway, Kevin Scott, the floor manager, was checking his watch nervously. The show would start in 30 minutes, and he had been given strict instructions to keep the 2 actors apart until they were on stage. So far, the plan was working. De Niro had been brought in through the south entrance, while Eastwood had come through the main doors. The audience was already seated, though they had no idea about the surprise that awaited them. The warm-up comedian had gotten them excited, and the energy in the studio was electric. In the control room, Jack watched the monitors with focused attention. On one screen, he could see Carol chatting with her co-hosts, Patricia Jones and Linda Freeman. On another, he watched as Eastwood finished in makeup and was led to the green room. A third showed De Niro still reviewing his notes. 5 minutes until we're live, announced the director. Is everyone in position? Jack confirmed and then spoke into his headset. Carol, remember, introduce Eastwood first, then bring out De Niro after he's seated. In the green room, Eastwood sat alone looking through a magazine about wildlife conservation. A production assistant peeked in. Mr. Eastwood, you'll be on in about 10 minutes. Across the studio, De Niro stood up as his makeup was completed. How do I look? He asked Nancy. Perfect, she replied, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. De Niro noticed. What's wrong? You seem tense. Nothing, Nancy said quickly. Just the usual pre-show jitters. As the final minutes ticked down, Susan Miller passed by the green room and glanced in at Eastwood. He looked calm, as always. She then hurried past De Niro's room, where she could hear him practicing his responses about his new crime drama film. Those two haven't spoken since that award ceremony incident, Susan whispered to her assistant, Pete Wilson. This could get really interesting. Or really bad, Pete replied. I heard Eastwood once walked off a show when they surprised him with a guest he didn't want to meet. The lights in the studio dimmed slightly, signaling 1 minute until broadcast. The audience quieted down. Carol, Patricia, and Linda took their seats at the famous round table. The floor director counted down with his fingers. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to The View. Carol's voice rang out as the theme music played. The audience applauded on cue. We have an incredible show for you today. The first segment, with the lifestyle expert, went smoothly, though Jack noticed that both Patricia and Linda seemed distracted, knowing what was coming next. When the commercial break began, the floor erupted in activity. Are they both ready? Jack asked through his headset. Eastwood is at the stage entrance, came the reply. De Niro is still in his room. Carol took a deep breath as the floor director signaled they were coming back from commercial. She looked directly into the camera as it went live. Welcome back to The View. Our next guest is truly a legend. As an actor, he created some of the most iconic characters in film history, from The Man with No Name to Dirty Harry. As a director, he's won multiple Academy Awards. Please welcome the one and only Clint Eastwood. The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause as Eastwood walked onto the stage, his signature half-smile and squint instantly recognizable. He waved casually to the crowd before shaking hands with each of the hosts and taking a seat. It's wonderful to have you here, Carol said when the applause finally died down. It's good to be here, Eastwood replied in his famously soft-spoken manner. Now, before we talk about your amazing new documentary, Carol continued, her heart racing, we have another surprise guest joining us today. Eastwood's expression didn't change, but those who knew him well might have noticed a slight tensing in his jaw. He's one of the greatest actors of all time, with films ranging from The Godfather Part 2 to Goodfellas to The Irishman. Please welcome Robert De Niro. The audience gasped collectively before breaking into even louder applause. All eyes moved from De Niro, who was now walking onto the stage, to Eastwood, watching for his reaction. Eastwood's face remained impressively neutral, but he straightened his posture and his smile faded as De Niro appeared. The stage lights seemed to intensify as two of cinema's greatest legends prepared to face off. The studio fell into a tense silence as Robert De Niro approached the seating area. He nodded to the hosts with a professional smile, then turned to face Clint Eastwood. For 3 long seconds, the two men looked at each other without speaking. The camera operator zoomed in on their faces, capturing what would soon become one of the most analyzed moments in daytime television history. Then De Niro extended his hand. Clint, it's been a while. Eastwood stood and shook De Niro's hand firmly. Robert. His voice was even quieter than usual, forcing the sound technician to quickly adjust his microphone levels. In the control room, Jack Phillips exhaled slowly. At least they had shaken hands. That was something. He spoke into his headset. Carol, keep it moving. Don't let them sit in silence. Carol Wright nodded almost imperceptibly toward the camera. Well, this is certainly a treat for all of us today, she said, her voice bright with practiced enthusiasm. 2 legendary actors on our show at once. The audience, sensing they were witnessing something special, applauded again. Some people took out their phones to record the moment despite the no recording policy. "So, Clint," Patricia Jones began, following the adjusted script that Jack had rushed to the hosts during the commercial break, "you're here to tell us about your new documentary, Forgotten Trails, The Last Cowboys of America. What inspired you to make this film?" Eastwood settled back in his chair, visibly more comfortable discussing his work. "I've always been drawn to the American West," he explained. "These cowboys represent a way of life that's nearly gone now. Most of them are in their 80s and 90s. I wanted to capture their stories before they're lost forever." As Eastwood spoke, De Niro watched him with what appeared to be genuine interest. The initial tension seemed to ease slightly. "And Robert," Linda Freeman turned to De Niro, "your new film, The Last Score, is getting early Oscar buzz. Can you tell us about your character?" De Niro leaned forward. "I play Frank Marino, a former bank robber who's been living quietly for 20 years when his past catches up to him. It's about redemption, family, and whether people can truly change." "That sounds fascinating," Carol said, looking back and forth between the two men. "Both of you have had such incredible careers spanning many decades. How do you choose your projects now?" Eastwood answered first. "At my age, I don't have time to waste on things that don't matter. I look for stories that need to be told." Niro nodded. "I agree with Clint on that. Though our approaches might differ, we both want to make films that mean something." This moment of apparent agreement caused Jack to relax slightly in the control room. Maybe this wouldn't turn into a disaster after all. "Speaking of different approaches," Linda said, "you both have very distinct directing styles. Clint, you're famous for doing very few takes and having a quiet set. Robert, when you directed The Good Shepherd, you were known for taking time to explore many different possibilities. Can you talk about these different methods?" In the control room, Jack groaned. This wasn't part of the adjusted script. Linda had gone off book with a question that highlighted their differences. De Niro responded first. "Every director finds their own way. For me, I like to explore all the possibilities. Sometimes that means taking more time, doing more takes." He paused. "Some directors from the old school prefer to work faster, which has its place too, but the industry has evolved. Modern filmmaking allows for more experimentation." Although De Niro hadn't mentioned Eastwood by name, the implication was clear. The phrase "old school" hung in the air between them. The camera caught Eastwood's jaw tightening slightly. His eyes narrowed in his famous squint. The audience grew quiet, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Well," Eastwood said after a moment, "I believe in being prepared. When actors come to set knowing their lines and crew members know their jobs, you don't need 40 takes to get it right." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe that's just old school thinking." Patricia jumped in quickly. "Both approaches have certainly produced amazing films. Let's talk about your influences. Who were the directors or actors that inspired you when you were starting out?" Eastwood mentioned John Ford and Don Siegel, describing how they shaped his understanding of filmmaking. De Niro spoke about his long collaboration with Martin Scorsese. The conversation stayed professional, but there was an undercurrent of tension that everyone in the studio could feel. During a brief video clip showing highlights from Eastwood's documentary, the cameras caught De Niro leaning over to whisper something to Carol. She nodded with wide eyes. When the show returned from commercial break, Carol announced they would be taking questions from the audience. A young film student named Ryan stood up. "This question is for both of you," Ryan said nervously. "How do you think the film industry has changed since you started, and do you think it's for better or worse?" De Niro spoke first. "The technology has obviously transformed everything. We can do things now that weren't possible before. I think diversity in storytelling has improved, with more voices being heard. Those are positive changes." He paused, then continued. "But there's also a pressure to make everything bigger, faster, with more explosions and less substance. Some of that is concerning." Eastwood nodded slowly. "The tools have changed, but storytelling remains the same at its heart. What concerns me is that many young filmmakers rely too much on technology and forget about the basics. Good writing, good acting, good directing. Another audience member, an older woman named Betsy, asked about their most challenging roles. As you, they answered. The hosts exchanged relieved glances. The show was nearly halfway through without any major confrontation. Jack sent a message to Carol's teleprompter. Ask about future projects next. Carol followed the instruction. What's next for each of you? Any exciting projects in the works? I'm developing a film about the early days of Hollywood, Eastwood said. The transitions from silent films to talkies put a lot of good actors out of work. It's about adapting to change. De Niro shifted in his seat. I'm actually looking at a script about two directors with very different styles who are forced to work together. He glanced at Eastwood. It explores whether people with fundamentally different approaches can find common ground. Linda seized on this. That sounds fascinating. Speaking of different approaches, you two have famously different political views as well. Do you think it's possible for people with opposing political beliefs to work together effectively in today's climate? Jack stood up in the control room. What is she doing? That wasn't in the script. He pressed his talk button. Cut to commercial. Now. But it was too late. The camera was already focused on Eastwood's face as he considered the question. Politics and art are different arenas, Eastwood said carefully. In my experience, good work comes from honest disagreement sometimes, as long as there's respect. De Niro's expression was unreadable. Respect is key, he agreed. But there are some views that I find difficult to respect, especially when they hurt vulnerable people. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Carol looked frantically toward the control room, but the commercial break was still 30 seconds away. Can you elaborate on that, Robert? Patricia asked, seemingly unaware of the dangerous territory they were entering. De Niro hesitated, then spoke directly to Eastwood rather than the hosts. Some people hold on to outdated ideas because they worked in the past, but the world changes. We need to adapt, not cling to the past just because it's comfortable. The red light on the main camera blinked, indicating they were going to commercial in 10 seconds. But before the break could save them, Eastwood leaned forward in his chair. You know what I think, Robert? He said, his voice quiet but carrying across the silent studio. I think sometimes people confuse change with improvement. The on-air sign dimmed as the show cut to commercial. The studio erupted in frantic activity. Makeup artists rushed to touch up both actors' faces. Production assistants brought fresh water. Jack Phillips sprinted from the control room onto the set, his face flushed with a mixture of stress and excitement. What was that? He whispered urgently to Carol. We agreed no politics. Carol shrugged helplessly. Linda went off script. I couldn't stop it. Jack turned to the two actors. Mr. Eastwood, Mr. De Niro, I apologize for the unexpected direction of the conversation. When we come back, we'll focus solely on your current projects. De Niro nodded. Curtly. Eastwood sipped his water without responding. Linda leaned over to Carol. The ratings must be through the roof right now. My phone is blowing up with texts. Indeed, across the country, people were calling friends and family, telling them to turn on their televisions. Social media was already exploding with clips and comments about the tension between the two Hollywood legends. Kevin Scott, the floor manager, counted down the seconds until they returned from commercial. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The on-air sign lit up again. Carol's professional smile returned instantly. Welcome back to The View. We're here with Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro discussing their incredible careers and new projects. She turned to face the camera directly. Let's move to a topic I think we're all curious about. Both of you have played some of the most iconic characters in film history. Do you have a personal favorite among your roles? It was a safe question, designed to steer the conversation back to neutral territory. Eastwood responded first. I've always had a soft spot for Josie Wales, he said, referring to his role in the 1976 Western, The Outlaw Josie Wales. He was a man who lost everything but found a new family. There's something powerful about that journey. De Niro nodded, apparently willing to follow the safer path of conversation. For me, it might be Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver. Playing someone so isolated, so disconnected from society, was a challenge that taught me a lot about the craft. Patricia picked up the thread. Both of those characters were outsiders in their own way. Is that something that draws you to a role? This question led to a thoughtful discussion about character development. For a few minutes, the tension seemed to ease as both men spoke passionately about their craft. The audience watched, fascinated by the rare opportunity to hear two masters discuss their art. During this calmer exchange, Mike Turner, the sound engineer, whispered to his assistant, "They're both pros. They know how to put on a good show." His assistant nodded. "But did you see Eastwood's face when De Niro mentioned outdated ideas? I thought he was going to walk off the set." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden shift in the studio atmosphere. Linda had asked another question, this time about method acting versus more traditional approaches. "Some actors live in their characters for months," Linda said. "Others can step in and out of a role between takes. Robert, you're famous for your method approach, while Clint, you've described your style as more straightforward. Can you talk about these different techniques?" De Niro shifted in his seat. "For me, becoming the character as completely as possible helps find truth in the performance. When I worked on Raging Bull, I trained as a boxer for months, then gained 60 pounds to play the older LaMotta. That physical transformation helps me find the emotional core." Eastwood listened with his head slightly tilted. When De Niro finished, he spoke quietly. "I respect the dedication that takes," he said, "but I've always believed that acting is about imagination, not becoming someone else. You pretend convincingly. When the director says cut, you go back to being yourself." De Niro smiled thinly. "Different approaches work for different actors." "True," Eastwood agreed. "Though sometimes I wonder if younger actors today confuse intensity with quality. Shouting isn't always good acting." Though he hadn't directly criticized De Niro, whose performances often included emotional outbursts, the implication hung in the air. The camera caught De Niro's eyes narrowing slightly. "Emotion is part of the human experience," De Niro responded. "Showing that on screen requires vulnerability. Some actors and directors from the old generation prefer a more restrained approach, which has its place. But cinema has evolved." There it was again. The phrase "old generation" that seemed aimed directly at Eastwood. The audience grew quiet, sensing the renewed tension. Carol jumped in quickly. "Both approaches have created unforgettable performances. Let's take another question from our audience." A middle-aged man named Frank stood up. "This question is for both of you. How do you feel about the increasing use of CGI and special effects in movies today?" Eastwood answered first. "When used properly, these tools can enhance storytelling. The problem comes when filmmakers rely on effects instead of story and character. A computer can't generate emotion." De Niro nodded. "I agree with that. Though, I think the new technology also opens doors for stories that couldn't be told before. It's about balance." This moment of agreement seemed to ease the tension slightly. But as the conversation continued, Kevin Scott noticed something interesting happening between the two men. They had started addressing each other directly rather than speaking to the hosts. "The thing about practical effects," Eastwood said, looking at De Niro, "is that they give actors something real to respond to." "That's true," De Niro replied. "Though good actors can imagine what isn't there, that's part of the craft." Their back and forth continued, becoming more personal but not necessarily more antagonistic. It was as if they had forgotten the audience and were simply having a professional conversation. During a video package about De Niro's new film, Carol leaned over to Patricia and whispered, "This is fascinating. They clearly respect each other, professionally, but disagree on almost everything." When the cameras returned to the set, Linda asked about their experiences working with young actors. "I find the new generation inspiring," De Niro said. "They bring fresh perspectives and energy to the set, though sometimes they need guidance about the fundamentals of the craft." Eastwood nodded. "I've worked with many young actors who impressed me with their dedication. The good ones listen and learn regardless of how many Instagram followers they have." This small joke broke some of the tension. De Niro actually smiled. The audience, who had been holding their collective breath during the more tense exchanges, laughed with relief. But then Patricia asked the question that would trigger the most dramatic moment of the show. You've both been in the industry through enormous changes, from technology to social movements. What changes have you welcomed, and which ones concern you? De Niro spoke first. The push for greater diversity and inclusion has been long overdue. Seeing more voices and perspectives on screen makes cinema richer. He paused. What concerns me is the growing polarization in our society, where people can't even agree on basic facts anymore. Some public figures use their platform to spread misinformation that hurts vulnerable communities. Though he didn't look at Eastwood directly, the reference to Eastwood's past political statements seemed clear. The audience grew completely silent. Eastwood set down his coffee mug with deliberate slowness. The studio grew so quiet that the sound engineer would later remark that he could hear the air conditioning humming. "You know, Robert," Eastwood said, his voice low but perfectly audible, "I've respected your work for decades. But there's a difference between playing tough guys and being one." De Niro leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locked with Eastwood's. The entire studio held its breath. In the control room, Jack Phillips stood frozen, knowing this moment would either destroy the show or make television history. "And there's a difference," De Niro replied, his voice low and controlled, "between talking to empty chairs and having something meaningful to say." The reference to Eastwood's infamous 2012 Republican National Convention speech, where he had spoken to an empty chair pretending it was President Obama, hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Several audience members gasped. Patricia and Linda exchanged alarmed glances while Carol frantically signaled to the director to cut to commercial. But before they could break away, Eastwood's expression hardened. "At least I speak as myself, not hiding behind characters. Some people spend so much time pretending to be other people that they forget who they really are." The floor director was making slashing motions across his throat, desperately trying to get Carol to interrupt, but she sat transfixed like everyone else in the studio. De Niro's face flushed slightly. "Method acting is about finding truth, Clint. Something that seems in short supply these days. When you supported a man who told over 30,000 documented lies during his presidency, where was your concern for truth then?" Susan Miller, watching from the side of the stage, whispered to her makeup assistant, "This is getting personal. Should someone stop them?" The assistant shook his head. "Are you kidding? This is amazing television." On stage, Eastwood's jaw tightened, visibly, but his voice remained calm and measured. "The problem with method acting, Robert, is sometimes you forget who you really are. I've always played characters, but I've never confused them with myself." De Niro scoffed. "That's rich coming from a man who played a tough guy with a gun so many times that half of America thinks he actually is Dirty Harry." The tension in the studio was almost unbearable. Carol finally found her voice. "Perhaps we should take a short break." "No," Eastwood interrupted, surprising everyone. "Let's finish this conversation. Robert and I have known each other for over 50 years. We can speak honestly." De Niro nodded slowly. "Fine. Let's be honest then. You've used your platform to support policies that hurt immigrants, minorities, and working people. You call that truth?" Eastwood didn't flinch. "And you've used your platform to insult anyone who disagrees with you politically, calling them names instead of trying to understand their perspective. Is that respectful dialogue?" The audience was completely silent now, watching the verbal sparring match between two Hollywood legends like spectators at a championship bout. Even the camera operators seemed mesmerized, their usual subtle movements frozen as they captured every nuance of the confrontation. De Niro leaned back slightly. "I get passionate because I care about people who are suffering. When I see policies that cause harm, yes, I speak up. That's my right as a citizen. And it's my right to have different opinions about what policies actually help people," Eastwood countered. "Disagreement isn't disrespect, Robert. It's the foundation of democracy." Linda, perhaps sensing a chance to channel the confrontation in a more productive direction, jumped in. "That's actually a fascinating point. Can you both talk about how you separate your personal politics from your art? You've both worked with people across the political spectrum throughout your careers." This thoughtful question seemed to shift the energy slightly. De Niro took a sip of water before answering. On set, the work comes first, he said. I've worked with people whose politics I strongly disagree with, but we found common ground in the story we were telling. Eastwood nodded. Film sets are like America should be. Different people with different backgrounds and beliefs working together toward a common goal. The problems start when we forget how to listen to each other. For a moment, the two men seemed to have found a sliver of common ground. But then a phone rang somewhere in the audience, breaking the moment. The ringtone was the theme from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, one of Eastwood's most famous films. Several people laughed nervously. As the phone's owner scrambled to silence it, De Niro shook his head. The problem, Clint, is that some views cause real harm to real people. It's not just a difference of opinion when policies separate children from their parents at the border, or when rhetoric inspires violence against minorities. Eastwood's eyes narrowed. And demonizing half the country as racist or stupid doesn't cause harm? When celebrities like you call people names for voting differently, that doesn't divide us further? The back and forth was heating up again. In the control room, Jack was simultaneously terrified and thrilled. The show was now running 7 minutes over its allotted time, but the network had called to say they were clearing the schedule to let it continue. Early ratings numbers were astronomical. Carol tried again to moderate. You both clearly care deeply about America, even if you see different paths forward. What common values do you think all Americans might still share? This thoughtful question seemed to give both men pause. The audience leaned forward, waiting. Eastwood spoke first. Freedom. The right to speak your mind without fear. The ability to pursue your dreams regardless of where you started. Those are values worth protecting. De Niro nodded slowly. I agree with that. I'd add compassion for those who are struggling. A belief that we're all better off when we help each other. A commitment to truth and facts, not convenient fictions. Truth isn't always convenient for either side, Eastwood replied. Sometimes it's complicated. On that we can agree, De Niro said. The tension in the studio had shifted from hostile to something more complex. Two strong-willed men with fundamental disagreements but a grudging respect for each other's conviction. The audience seemed to sense this change, the atmosphere less like watching a fight and more like witnessing an important conversation. Kevin Scott, the floor manager, whispered to Jack, "Should we wrap it up?" Jack shook his head. "Not yet. This is incredible." Patricia spoke up. "You've both had extraordinary careers spanning many decades. What do you hope your legacy will be, beyond the films you've made?" Eastwood considered the question. "I hope people remember me as someone who told stories honestly, who never talked down to the audience, and who stood by his principles even when they weren't popular." De Niro was quiet for a moment. "I hope I'm remembered as someone who used whatever platform I had to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. And yes, as someone who told the truth as I saw it, even when it was uncomfortable." As they spoke, something unexpected happened. The fundamental humanity beneath their political differences began to emerge. The audience could see that despite their clashing worldviews, both men shared a deep passion for their craft and for their country. Carol noticed this shift and skillfully guided the conversation toward their shared experiences in Hollywood. The directors they had both admired, the changes they had witnessed in the industry. For several minutes, the two legends exchanged stories about the old days of filmmaking, occasionally even making each other laugh. Just as it seemed the confrontation had transformed into a collegial discussion, Linda asked one final question that would become the most talked about moment of the entire episode. "If you two were cast in a film together tomorrow," she asked, "what kind of story would you want it to be?" Eastwood looked directly at De Niro. "Something about two old warriors who've been fighting so long they've forgotten what they're fighting for. Maybe they discover they have more in common than they thought." De Niro held Eastwood's gaze. "I'd add that these warriors would still have real, substantial disagreements, but they'd find a way to talk to each other instead of past each other. That's a story America needs right now." In that moment, something shifted between them. Not agreement exactly, but a recognition of each other's humanity that transcended their political divide. The studio remained silent after De Niro's words about warriors finding a way to talk to each other. The audience seemed to be holding its collective breath, sensing that something remarkable was happening between these two legendary figures. Carol looked at her notes, unsure how to proceed after such a powerful moment. Before she could speak, Eastwood did something unexpected. He laughed. Not a mocking laugh, but a genuine one that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You know what Scorsese told me about you back in the 90s? Eastwood asked De Niro. De Niro raised an eyebrow. "No, what did Marty say?" "He said you were the most stubborn man he'd ever worked with, but also the most committed to finding the truth in every scene." Eastwood shook his head. Seems he was right on both counts. After a moment of surprise, De Niro burst into laughter. Genuine, unrestrained laughter that transformed his face. "Damn it, Clint," he said, shaking his head. "That's exactly what Marty said to me 30 years ago about you two. Said you were impossible to budge once you made up your mind." Eastwood's stern expression held for a moment before cracking into a smile. Scorsese always did have good insight. The audience, who had been witness to their tense confrontation, released a collective sigh of relief that turned into applause. Carol, Patricia, and Linda exchanged confused glances, not quite understanding what had just happened. Carol leaned forward. "It seems like there's more history between you two than the public knows." De Niro nodded. "We've known each other for decades, crossed paths many times. Disagreed just as many times," Eastwood added. "But there's always been respect." In the control room, Jack turned to his assistant producer. "Are they friends? Did we know this?" No one had an answer. The show was now 15 minutes over its scheduled time, but the network had called twice to say they should keep going as long as possible. Viewership was climbing by the minute as word spread about the extraordinary exchange happening live on daytime television. Patricia tried to regain some control of the conversation. "So despite your political differences, you've maintained a professional relationship?" Eastwood and De Niro exchanged a look that seemed to contain a private joke. "Something like that," De Niro said cryptically. The final segment was supposed to be a quick wrap-up, but Carol made an executive decision. "Before we end today, I'm curious. If you two could collaborate on a project, what would it be?" Again, that mysterious look passed between the two men. Then De Niro turned to face the audience directly. "Actually," he said, "we should probably tell everyone the truth now." A murmur went through the studio. The hosts looked alarmed. In the control room, Jack stood up straight, suddenly worried about what might be coming. Eastwood nodded. "It's time." De Niro reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. He opened it carefully and laid it on the table. It was a photograph of Eastwood and De Niro standing together, arms around each other's shoulders, both smiling, broadly. They looked much younger in the image. "This was taken in 1974, De Niro explained, "after I saw Clint in Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. I was a young actor then, and I went up to him at a Hollywood event to tell him how much I admired his work." Eastwood picked up the story. "Robert was just breaking out then. I'd seen him in Mean Streets and told him he was going to be one of the greats. We ended up talking for hours that night about acting, directors, where we thought movies were headed. The entire studio was silent as everyone tried to process this revelation. The two men who had just been engaged in heated debate were now sharing a story of friendship that spanned nearly 50 years. Linda looked confused. "But what about your famous feud, the political disagreements, the award ceremony incident?" Eastwood and De Niro exchanged another look before De Niro answered. "That's all real," he said. "We do disagree on politics, strongly. We've had arguments that made today look tame. But," Eastwood continued, "we never let it destroy the respect we have for each other as artists and as men. That's something that seems lost today." De Niro nodded. "We came up in a different time. You could disagree with someone, even fight with them without making them your enemy." As they spoke, Kevin Scott noticed something odd. Alice Howard, a woman he recognized as a well-known Hollywood publicist, had appeared at the side of the stage and was watching with a satisfied smile. She caught Kevin looking at her and gave him a small wink. Carol was still trying to make sense of the situation. So today, all of this tension was mostly real. De Niro assured her. We didn't plan what we would say. Those are our genuine differences. But, Eastwood added, we did plan to have this conversation in public. Now everyone looked completely confused. Patricia leaned forward. I don't understand. Are you saying this was staged? Not staged, De Niro clarified. More like orchestrated. The disagreements are real. The respect is real too. Alice Howard stepped forward now, moving into the edge of the camera frame. She spoke to Carol. May I explain? Carol, too stunned to object, nodded. Alice smiled at the camera. My name is Alice Howard. I represent both Mr. Eastwood and Mr. DE. Niro for this particular project. What you've witnessed today was partly spontaneous and partly planned. These two legends genuinely disagree on many issues, but they've agreed to use those disagreements to make an important point. She nodded to Eastwood, who took over the explanation. Robert and I are making a film together, he said simply. The first time we've worked together in our long careers, the audience gasped. This was major news in the entertainment world. De Niro explained further. It's called Common Ground. We play two former friends, a conservative and a liberal, who haven't spoken in years but are forced to work together. We've been developing it secretly for months, Eastwood added, and we realized that the best way to announce it was to show rather than tell. To demonstrate exactly what the film is about, De Niro continued. How people with fundamental differences can still find a way to communicate, to work together, even to care about each other. The audience burst into applause. Some people were standing now, clearly moved by this unexpected turn of events. Alice Howard stepped back as Carol tried to regain her composure. So the confrontation we just witnessed was a promotion for your film? No, Eastwood said firmly. The disagreements were genuine. We didn't script what we would say to each other. But the decision to have this conversation in public on your show was planned, De Niro added. We wanted to show that civil disagreement is still possible. That's what our film is about. Carol shook her head in amazement. Well, you've certainly given us an unforgettable hour of television. Eastwood smiled. We hope we've given something more valuable than that. A reminder that people who disagree, even strongly, don't have to be enemies. As the show finally came to a close, the two actors stood and shook hands. The audience gave them a standing ovation that continued long after the cameras stopped rolling. In the weeks that followed, the episode would become the most watched in the history of The View, with clips gathering over 50 million views online. Cultural commentators from across the political spectrum wrote about the exchange, analyzing what it meant for public discourse in a divided nation. 6 months later, when Common Ground was released, critics hailed it as one of the most important films of both men's careers. It told the story of two former friends divided by politics who rediscovered their shared humanity while working on a community project together. In the film's most powerful scene, the characters played by Eastwood and De Niro sit on a porch as the sun sets, sharing a bottle of whiskey and finally having the honest conversation they've avoided for years. They don't resolve their political differences, but they remember why they were friends in the first place. When asked in interviews if that scene was based on real conversations between them, both actors would smile and say the same thing. Some truths are better shown than told.